All right, on to part 4 of chapter 19. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen and we will continue with our part 4. So here is part 4, dealing with population growth. And there we are. Okay, so population growth. Well, what we're talking about obviously is how a population can grow. Is it growing? Is it declining? Is it stable? But whatever it is, we have to try and figure out how does a population grow. And just as with the life history, there are two models, and these are kind of the extremes once again. The first one is the exponential growth model. And when you have an exponential growth model, it means you basically have a geometric progression with the population increasing. And so here you can see that you start with one individual cell at time 0. So if you have a bacterial culture, perhaps, and these bacteria, every 20 minutes, they divide. So after 20 minutes, you have 2, 40 minutes, you have 4, 60 minutes, 8, and then it doubles every 20 minutes. Now, if it doubles every 20 minutes, there's the reason why when you wake up in the morning, you are going to have a sore throat, because the bacteria in the back of your throat may have may have grown exponentially throughout the night, and they now create this soreness. Why would bacteria grow well in the back of your throat? Well, think about it. It's nice and moist. It's warm. It's got lots of nutrients. And as you breathe, you're providing oxygen all the time. And of course, there is a significant amount of space, so it's a perfect place for these bacteria to grow. Now, usually, when you start to have an infection, you don't start with one. You may start with hundreds of bacteria. And of course, then you end up with billions of them by the time morning rolls around. Now, one of the issues, though, is that these bacteria are eventually going to encounter resistance. Either it's a resistance because your immune system starts to kick in, or perhaps it's resistance that comes from within their population because they're getting crowded out. There aren't going to be as many nutrients as they need. There may be more waste products in that area. And so as a consequence, sometimes the growth will become limited. So in nature, exponential growth tends to be curbed at some point, but in a lab, we may be able to let it go. So here in this graph, you can see that there is a flask with some medium in it, and in a medium like this, you can experience very rapid growth. But even in a medium like that, you're going to end up with limiting conditions eventually. And so if you just let the bottle sit there, well, it's not going to do much after a couple of days. And so as a consequence of this, exponential growth is something that you don't encounter in nature indefinitely, because there's always going to be something that stops the growth. Now, what stops the growth? Well, this is something that we're going to discuss in the next slide. But basically, clearly, if bacteria could grow unlimited in an unlimited way, well, then the whole planet would be overgrown with bacteria, and it clearly isn't. So there must be something else that curbs the growth. Unfortunately, there are sometimes conditions in nature, certainly when organisms are introduced into non-native habitats, that you can experience this kind of exponential growth. So here are, in the state of Victoria in Australia, rabbits were introduced in the late 1800s, and they spread and spread and spread. Now, this is primarily desert, so they were having trouble in the really desert areas, but all the way around, lots of rabbits. Rabbits reproduce very rapidly, and it's taken a significant amount of work to get them under control, because obviously they compete with other grazers, with other small herbivores. They compete with wallabies. They compete with some of the other native fauna, and so this is obviously a problem. Same kind of thing with the toads down here. This is a pretty nice, hefty toad. And toads are native to South America, these kinds of toads, and they were introduced in Australia. And the reason why they were introduced is because Australia was in the process of testing out different crops, and sugarcane was one of them. sugarcane pests exist, and these toads eat some of these. So they thought, well, we'll bring the toads in as a sort of natural controlling agency, natural pest control, but it spectacularly backfired because these toads were starting to eat not only the things that they were supposed to eat, but they're eating all the other things, some of the native frogs, some of the native lizards, some of the native insects, all kinds of stuff. And they didn't even need to focus on these sugarcane pests. So it really didn't work. And as you can see here, the toads have been moving across Australia. There are all kinds of interesting things that, that happen. Well, first of all, if you're traveling by road in Australia at night, you'll see a lot of toads on the roads, and it's very difficult to swerve and avoid them. So you literally just drive over these toads because they're a nuisance. They're like a plague. And so as a consequence of this, toads are not liked particularly well in Australia. There is a little bit of an industry that's starting to produce leather products from the toad skin, which is pretty tough. And that works to an extent, but it hasn't really caught on so well. So what actually happens? Well, one of the things that actually happens is that there are limits in place, and the environment itself has some of the limits that come from within the population that limit its growth. Now, that's then the logistic growth model. And whereas what you saw before with the exponential growth model was a J-shaped curve, here you have an S-shaped curve. So there's your S-shaped curve. And that is really what happens in wild populations, and that's a better way of looking at a population's growth. Now, there is also in wild populations the tendency to get to a carrying capacity. That's how many organisms the environment can support, and that's roughly where it stays. It may oscillate a little bit around that carrying capacity, but by and large, that's where you're going to be. So here, the example shows you the population of breeding male fur seals. So this is only the males we're looking at. And the number of males had been reduced in the late 1800s because of hunting. And this was just a great place to go in the South Atlantic. There's lots of these, and people thought, heck, it's just a few seals, and we need fur, and we need blankets, and so on. And so there were a lot of people that came through that area, and so this was clearly an overexertion. So the population was reduced to a very low number. Then people started to realize if we don't leave them alone for a while, we're not going to have any. And so the population began to increase. And as in all natural populations, they start by going into exponential growth. So growth initially was very rapid, and this rapid growth happens until you reach an inflection point. And this is where it shifts, where things start to turn towards the S of the S-shaped curve. So the upper portion here, as you can see, it kind of oscillates. It goes up above 10,000, then below, then above, then below, then below. So there's a little bit of oscillation. It's not very regular, but that's okay. But it seems to indicate that the carrying capacity for breeding male fur seals in this environment is just shy of 10,000 individuals. And so when you are now going to hunt, if that's what you wanted to do, then you could bring them back down to a number maybe around here so that you're still in the steepest increase. And then you wait for a few more years, and then you could harvest again if this is what you were trying to do. Consider this population a resource if you must have these furs, if you need certain kind of things. But this is really with any population that you see in nature, you can bring it down if you want to harvest it to this fast growing area and then let it grow back again. So if humans were going to be involved in terms of harvesting populations of anything, really, this could include fish population, this could include fur seals, this could include any other natural population, then we have to be careful that we never go below this inflection point, that we're always at the quickest growth and we leave the population there. Now, what factors are producing this carrying capacity? What helps level this curve out? So most of these are density dependent. So this is the density dependent regulation of population growth. And the factors that contribute to this, let me just move this down here. The factors that contribute to that slowing are generally some things that have to do with the population itself, because there are more resources needed for these larger numbers. You have more neighbors that you're going to have to share with. And ultimately, this results in something called intra-specific competition. Remember, we're dealing with a population here, one species. Intra means within the population, within the species. So intra-specific competition. This is the kind of thing you experience when you try to find parking here on a Monday morning, right? It's the competition for parking spots. That's your resource. And there's usually too many of you to all park near one of the buildings where you need to go. So you also experience intra-specific competition. And so as a consequence of this, you can see that when population growth is slowed, it actually has something to do with how many individuals are in the population. If the population is already pretty much filling the environment where it lives, then you don't expect a lot of growth. You may expect that the population maintains its level, maintains its numbers, doesn't go down, doesn't go up, maybe just a little fluctuation, and that's it. Stable population, that is maybe where you end up with density dependent factors. To give you a couple of examples here, these factors tend to slow the population growth rate and make the size be near the carrying capacity, so it limits the size. And as the population grows bigger, these effects become a little bit more serious until the population stops growing, and that's it. So on the left with these birds, you'll see on the lower end of the number of breeding pairs, they can produce up to 12 eggs on average. And then as there are more breeding pairs, that number goes down to a third less, so down to 8. Now, the individual birds, they don't look around and say, oh, how many other breeding pairs are they? They don't count them on their fingers and toes. But what happens is they encounter them more frequently. They hear them more frequently because many of these birds are songbirds. And so what you'll find is that the stressors that these encounters are causing, these stressors, they prevent the development of the hormones and the eggs inside the female to the extent that they could. So more encounters, more stress, fewer hormones, fewer eggs. And that's why you end up with these lower numbers. So it's not something that completely switches off egg laying, but it lowers it. So it depresses it because of the stress factors. Then when you're looking at the flower beetles, and these are really teeny tiny beetles, so that's why you have so many in only a small amount of flour, you'll find that under normal conditions, their survivorship is around 60%. But then when you increase numbers above 40, that's sort of a threshold here, above 40, then the numbers dwindle and the survivorship goes way down. So if you have 120 of these beetles, then you just cut your survivorship into 3. So the survivorship at higher densities is only a third of what it is at a lower density. So clearly, if you want a stable population and a healthy population, then you need to pay attention to its size. There are also density independent factors that have nothing to do with how many individuals are in the population. And the example shown in this graph here is for aphids, and many of you who may have roses in the high desert, you know that aphids can be a pest. And you'll find that during the growing season of the roses, you sometimes have just a lot of aphids on there. Well, if you then have a sudden abiotic event, whether that's heat or that's freezing, these populations can crash, even though it's entirely unrelated to how many of them there are. So in nature, these populations don't actually ever reach the carrying capacity because they crash and burn well before they do. So here's your J-shaped curve. And it hasn't even started flattening out yet. So the number of aphids is still increasing, but it's already crashing because, heck, in mid-June, you're going to see higher temperatures, less water available, moisture content in the air is much lower, and ultimately it means that these aphids don't survive very well. So the population crashes, and there's a few left to carry the population over until the next year. So they have this boom in the population, and then the bust. Boom and bust, boom and bust, and that's how it goes every year based on density independent factors. So they never actually reach their potential in the environment. And this kind of thing, these cycles, boom and bust, they can also occur with populations fluctuating together. So here in this example, you have a predator-prey relationship, snowshoe hare and lynxes. Snowshoe hare in the image on the left clearly is barely managing to get away from the lynx. This would ordinarily play itself out in northern climates, maybe parts of Canada. And what you'll find when you look at the graph is that the blue line, the snowshoe hare, peaks and crashes, peaks and crashes, peaks and crashes. And the number of individuals is indicated on the left side of this graph. And then in red, you have the lynx population, the numbers indicated on the right side of the graph, and they also boom and crash and boom and crash and boom and crash. Pretty much coordinated, synced up with the snowshoe hare. So it turns out that in its environment, the snowshoe hares have a natural resource that they depend on. And when that natural resource cycles, they have natural cycles, so these plants and their seeds, well, then the snowshoe hare population is going to crash. Lynxes that depend on the snowshoe hares are going to crash a little bit later, because when the going is good for snowshoe hares, the lynx population is able to eat a lot of them, and the lynx population is healthy and they produce a lot of young. But in lynxes, the young take a year longer to mature. Snowshoe hares can reproduce the first year after they're born. Lynxes have to wait. And so as a consequence, you're going to have a little bit of a lag. So as the snowshoe hares crash, the lynx population is still going, hey, where are they all? There's so many of us. Now we don't have enough. Well, obviously that makes the lynx population crash in the following cycle. So that's why you can see there's always a little offset. Here is the peak in the snowshoe hares, and a little bit later, a couple of years later, you find that the lynx population crashes. And so here it is, snowshoe hares, lynxes, snowshoe hares, lynxes, snowshoe hares, lynxes. There's always that little bit of a difference. Now, one interesting thing to point out is, how'd you get these data? 1850 to 1940 up here? Well, it was not somebody who was sitting in the Canadian wilderness for 100 years who was making all these observations. This is actually due to the trade that happened up in those territories. The Hudson Bay Company was involved in trading, and since people there didn't have much money, what they had, or what they could produce, was pelts. Snowshoe hare, nice white color, highly in demand in some places. Lynx, even nicer fur, I think, than the snowshoe hare. And so these pelts that the trappers brought could be used as trade. They would get their food, and the Hudson Bay Company would keep notes of how many pelts, how many trappers, and so on. And then somebody got a hold of these numbers and very cleverly realized that there was actually this type of boom and bust cycling going on. So really interesting kind of stuff. Now, to finish up this discussion, let's talk about the human population and how it grows. Well, it's been growing, clearly, growing a lot. About 1900, you had maybe 1 billion people, and then it began to increase. Why would the human population suddenly, after thousands of years, get much quicker, much bigger, much more quickly? Well, it is because we got to the point where, first of all, we improved nutrition. People started to figure out how to do agriculture well. Secondly, we figured out more about diseases and provided better health care that allowed greater longevity. So people lived longer and people lived better. Then we also learned how to reduce the influence of our neighbors. We became more tolerant, and that was not because people like each other better or worse. It was simply because there were mechanisms put in place that improved sanitation. In the 1700s, when you lived in the city of London in the UK, well, most people, they didn't have plumbing, indoor plumbing. So what you had to do in the morning, what they did in the morning, they threw open the windows because it smelled bad in the room, and they took their chamber pot, that's what you use instead of a toilet, and they emptied it out the window. Well, that's not very nice. If you have lots of people living in the same place, it's really starting to smell. And so the Great Fire of London really helped cleanse out some of that, ironically, and sanitation improved after that. So when they rebuilt it, they produced some better sanitation. In general, urbanization tends to be better for people. And that again reflects the need for healthcare and better nutrition. If you are a little house on the prairie, well, it's going to take a while for you to go to the doctor. And you can't just go to the store and buy food. So it's all laborious to get it done. And urbanization, of course, provides for most people better income and better living conditions than what life on the farm can bring today. So as a consequence, you have these incredible increases. I mean, this very dramatic increase went zzzt. It really got into the J, the proper J shape of exponential growth only around the turn of the century to the year 1900. Now, there were a couple of places where it increased dramatically. After the First World War, it increased because people were happy the war was over. After the Second World War, same kind of scenario. People were happy the war was over, and there was a little bit more of international understanding, and the risk of war became reduced, and so the population just increased. Of course, there's one other critical element here, and that was the advent of antibiotics that happened right around the end of the Second World War. So as a consequence, we've seen this population increase dramatically. When I was young, we had roughly 3.5, 4 billion people. Now we're at 7.3 billion. So the human population almost doubled during my lifetime. That's saying something. We do see now that there is a little bit of a decrease in the population increase. So it means the population isn't growing as fast as it used to. And that may be the indication that we're actually reaching this inflection point. And maybe then the carrying capacity is somewhere around 10 billion. But who knows? Who knows what the effect is of COVID, for example, when people aren't able to get together the way they have been in the past. And also the way we now have our 24/7 news coverage, and we can access it very easily through our phones, and we see what's going on in other places of the world. And that may make many people think twice about how many children they're going to have. So these are the kind of things that we encounter when it comes to population growth. And that is the end of part 4. So hopefully that works, and I'm going to post these ASAP.